Good morning again. I'm really happy to be here. I want to acknowledge Diana has been a member of the Death Cafe that I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I'm really glad to see you and appreciate you reaching out with this so that Doris could organize us. I think to start with, what I would like to do before I share my story and some thoughts on death is to establish our attention and intention in a Buddhist way, since that is my tradition. So I would like to remove this and if I can so they can hear me. Okay, so I'm hoping this will work. I'd like to share with you a basic meditation to begin with on our attention and intention. I would like to ask or invite you, obviously at your choice, to participate in this meditation to begin and establish our intention today together. So I would share a little bit of meditation instruction, and if you choose, you can join in with what I'm sharing. If you could sit up in your chair and move away from the back of the chair, we're bringing our body to attention, and in doing so, we want to hold our back straight. Think of your backbone as, say, coins that are stacked up, so that our shoulders are back, not stiff or uncomfortable, but at attention. Our hands are on the top of our thighs, feet flat on the floor, and the chin can be a little bit tucked in order to have a comfortable alignment for your jaw, which can be relaxed. If you put the tip of your tongue on the roof of your mouth, it helps to relax your jaw as you're sitting. This is a Tibetan singing bowl. I love everything Tibetan. When I share my story, I'll tell you that early on, Tibetan Buddhist practice is where I began, and I was lucky enough to get to travel to Tibet, which affected me greatly. So I will begin by gonging. I would invite you to close your eyes after the first gong. I will give just a couple of short instructions, and at the second gong, we'll open our eyes and begin. Notice your body, the feel of your feet on the floor, your bottom in the chair, your chest open. The earth supports you. Notice your breathing. Breathe normally, the breath in, the breath out. Your breath is always with you. I invite you to think about and acknowledge any intention for our time together today that you may have. Thank you. I don't like it that you're behind me. Let me move back just a little bit. I don't want to have my back to you guys. I thought I would start today with, what the heck am I doing sitting here talking to you about death? How did I get here? I think our life unfolds in many interesting ways, and in Buddhism there's a teaching on codependent arising. When we think of all the conditions that have come together for our experience to be here, to have our lives. I was born to a family in Lexington. I was actually born in Michigan, and then we moved to Lexington because my dad ran the engineering department at UK. I was raised in what I would call a very traditional 50s kind of family. My mom had been a nurse and stayed home and was a mother. My dad was what I would describe as sort of the absent-minded professor who was sort of out there doing his thing and not particularly involved in raising me and my two sisters. He was the provider. My mother was a Scottish immigrant. She came to this country when she was 16, and she was pretty much a hard-ass Scot. There was not a whole lot of emotional sharing or emotion that showed in my family. You knew something was going on when the freeze hit and nobody was talking, but there was not expressive love, anger, or a lot of emotional world. And so out of that, I became totally intrigued with emotions. They were something very alien to me, and I became very interested in trying to figure out what the heck does any of this mean. In fact, my mom's response to me bringing up questions or asking about things of meaning would always be, "Oh, why do you have to talk about everything? We don't need to try to talk about that." So I came from that sort of background with what I would say were loving parents, supportive parents. But I think in my years of counseling with people, I noticed this often happens. People are like, "What the heck? How did I get in this family?" And that often is the experience that we have. I have two sisters, and when we share stories about growing up or the effect on us, it's often like, "Now, where were you? Whose family were you in? That was not the one I was in." So those are the kinds of experiences growing up that I had. And I followed a very traditional path in the beginning. My parents were Presbyterian. They raised us in the Presbyterian church, going to Sunday school and having that exposure to religion. As a teenager, I said, I don't want to go to church. Went into that realm and began to not be as involved in the church through my young adult years. Got married at about 21, again on a traditional path. I had an education background. I was a speech and hearing therapist. Married for about 3.5 or 4 years when I had a son, and proceeded to have 3 sons in 4 years. Woo! After that, I actually worked at Planned Parenthood. They gave me a hard time about it. became very interested in community education, and as my boys grew up and went to school, I got involved there and did a lot of sex ed, community ed, spending a lot of time with teenagers. And from that work, I got interested in counseling, and I went back and got a graduate degree to become a school counselor, which I have been doing for years. And so I find that as the evolution came, specifically related to death, it was never discussed in my family. When I was growing up, you could say I was lucky. There were no traumatic deaths. I didn't even lose my grandparents until my late 20s. So I hadn't had real experiential events with death, but I was always the kid with that little bit of the anxiety gene and sort of worried about things and what do they mean. And so I was constantly searching or asking people questions about how they made sense of their life. My sister's kid about, oh my God, who have you not asked what happens after you die? I would always want to have those kind of conversations, and I read many books. I had many discussions. I was exploring those things. And then in the busyness of being married and having children, my husband at the time, ex-husband now, but my husband at the time was starting his own business. I was helping with that. We had the boys. So when we were raising the boys, I felt sort of that little kick of guilt in the back of my mind. I need to do something about them in church. So we began going back to the Presbyterian church, and I had my kids in Sunday school, thinking that was part of my responsibility as a parent. And so I was back at a church sort of involved, mainly getting my kids to Sunday school for a few years. During all this time, I continued to feel like I was searching and seeking, but not sure how or what. So a lot of it was done through reading. I began to get very interested. The more I dealt with things that were a challenge for me, the first significant death I experienced was my mother-in-law. And I can feel that again just sitting here, the impact of that on me, because she was the first loving mother figure in my life. And I felt it was amazing. I can hear her words when we got married and I came out of the church. She said, "We love you so much." I could cry with that now because I never heard that. And she was so open and loving and such a mother figure to me. 3.5 years after I had met her and was married, at 45, she was diagnosed with amyloidosis and died within 6 months. I was reeling from that loss, totally at a loss as to what to do with it. And I took on the caretaker role for everybody in the family and taking care of my father-in-law and doing those things. But that was the first really gut reality I had to deal with, the loss and the grief that came. And then as we moved on in the busyness of raising kids and the family, there were more and more challenges as my husband and I had more and more conflict. Oh yeah, I'm the one who never saw conflict and learned how to fight, and he loves to blow, and then it's over with. So those sorts of things happening in my personal life were creating more and more challenges. And I began suffering what I now recognize as anxiety and depression about what the heck, how do I make sense out of this? Where do I go with this? So as a result of that, I started looking at what can I do for my sanity. And I began exploring meditation and mindfulness in a non-religious context. And the first retreat I went to was at Omega. If any of you know about Omega in New York, it's a retreat center. And it was Stephen Levine. I don't know if you're familiar. He is a teacher and writer, and he had written a book, Who Dies, that I had read and been very affected by. And I went to one of his workshops at Omega. And it was one of those life-changing sort of events for me. It opened me up to the possibility of whoa, there are other people out here trying to figure out the same things. And it was like I found a way or a path that was very helpful to me. And in Lexington, if you know, there is the Shambhala Center, which is a Tibetan Buddhist-based meditation center. When I began going there, I started trying to figure out, which internet wasn't my deal then. This was in early 80s, mid 80s. Where could you learn that? What could I do? And I found out about them. And at the time, they had 2 tracks at the center. You could be learning mindfulness meditation, or you could be on a Buddhist track, learning Buddhist teachings. And I went in on the mindfulness meditation track and began going to their weekend trainings on mindfulness meditation. I found it very helpful. It was very important. I began doing that more and more. And as a result of going there and doing that, I got more intrigued with the Buddhist part of the teachings. And they had a library much like this there at the center with many books. And I was reading all sorts of books that they had available. And I began going to the Buddhist classes and trainings and retreats, and essentially took refuge vows and became a member of that Buddhist community. So I was involved there for years, and that's where the Tibetan teachings became very valuable to me. And when I read partly out of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, I read that book, and it was very helpful to me and was an important teaching as well. And then through the years, more challenges arose. I was dealing with the coming apart of my marriage, and that was another big challenge to take apart with my 3 sons, which is why I stayed as long as I did. But it needed to happen, and finally I did go through that, and I feel like my practice was very important to get me through challenges, and I learned the value of that. But as I went, there would be more and more understanding that suffering is a part of life, and the more we can deal with our own suffering, the more it's possible to help other people with their suffering. But until you're able to be with your own, it's a big challenge to be authentically helping anyone else. So that's the past of my path to get more involved with understanding and thinking about death. I want to be clear, I'm not sitting here telling you that I'm an expert about death and let me give you the deal, here's what happens. I'm telling you as a seeker and a searcher that one of my biggest challenges has been to learn to deal with the open question, the koan in Zen practice, the fact that there isn't perhaps a black and white answer to everything. I was often looking for that. I'm wanting it to be this thing, and then I'll know it's okay. So as I progressed in my practice, people would often reference, why don't you go to a retreat at Furnace Mountain? Furnace Mountain is a Zen retreat center that is here in Kentucky, near Natural Bridge. And I would be like, oh, well, I'm not Zen, I do Tibetan. And I was going to many Tibetan retreats where it would often be very expensive. They were usually in Colorado at a big center there. And so I thought, well, what the heck, I'm going to try that. So I went to Furnace Mountain for a weekend retreat and felt like I developed a very strong connection, often referenced as a heart connection, to the Zen master teacher there. Zen Master Daegok is the teacher on the mountain, and his wife, Daniela Mausen, is also a teacher. And because of the connection to them as teachers, I ended up going there more and more and being on retreat there and developing, as they say, rather than the teacher-student relationship, the spiritual friend. And what I found and the value of that was very important to me. And so I actually began practicing in the Zen community there. And there is a Lexington Zen Center that we practice on Sunday afternoons, and Daniela is our teacher at the Lexington Center, and Zen Master Dagok continues to be the teacher at Furnace Mountain. So this gets back to death in that I found somebody else who wanted to talk about and think about death, and that was my teacher, Daniela. And as part of our conversations at some time, we were talking about the Death Cafe. And two things I thought I would share with you about my experience today, and then I want to open it up a little bit with you all for the amount of time we may have, is one is, what the heck is the Death Cafe, which I find to be very valuable, and I'd like to share some things with you about that. And my personal practice about death or on death, which in Buddhism is called Maranasati, which is meditation on death. And there are practices that I am doing myself to learn more about death and be open to death. So first of all, I would share the Death Cafe was founded in 2011 by a man named John Underwood in London. In England, they had the first Death Cafe. And it was based on Café Mortels, which came out of Switzerland. And John Underwood, was very interested in trying to understand and help people be more open to death and looking at and experiencing all the thoughts and questions they may have around it. And so the model that he set up, those are two things I was going to tell you could look at. If you go online and look under Death Cafe, you'll find all sorts of information about how it was formed, the history of it, suggestions about how you set up a Death Cafe. But the main thing about a Death Cafe is it is to open up conversation, question, thoughts about death with people that would like to have the opportunity to have those discussions. And there is no agenda. There's no religious teaching attached. One of the ground rules is nobody's coming in trying to say, here's what it is, here's what it means, here's what you do. It's just open, comfortable conversation around death. So Daniela and I decided we would like to try to have a Death Cafe in Lexington and Furnace Mountain. So we named it the Bluegrass to Red River Gorge Death Cafe, and that's the second site you could look at online. And we offered the first Death Cafe at Furnace Mountain in the tea house, not in the temple. Again, not to be a certain religion at all. And we put it out on Facebook, which I give Daniela credit for. I'm not the big electronic internet girl. Facebook is not my thing. I work with teenagers and I avoid it like I can. So she put that out there, and also word of mouth through Furnace Mountain. I live in Midway, and I advertised there, put it up on the community board at the library and whatever. And at our first cafe that we had at Furnace Mountain, we had 18 to 20 people come, and essentially it's a 2-hour event. You show up at 1 o'clock at Furnace Mountain at the tea house. We have tea, coffee, cake, and cookies that Daniela and I made. They were delicious. And you try to create this comfortable atmosphere for people to be in and to open conversation. We sit in a circle, which is why I'd asked Doris if we could have informal circle sort of sitting here today. And we just simply open up the conversation. And so we go around and introduce ourselves and say, why did we show up at the Death Cafe? What were we bringing to this? And one of the opening things we throw out there for people to participate as they will, that I thought I would just do right now, is what word or words do you associate with death? Would anybody like to share something?
Permanence.
Pardon?
Permanence.
Permanence. sorrow, loss, pain, denial, anger, release, peace. And there is I think where we would go with that if we were meeting in a death cafe is with that we open up to how do you see anger when it comes to death? What is that anger about? Where is that coming from? Tell us about the sorrow you're referencing. What is that? And it might be that another person shares something from what you brought up. We also have a practice where we've taken many quotes that have been written about death, and you can divide up in small groups, and there's a basket on the table with quotes or words in it, and that just initiates some conversation in your group. So we try to have some big group activity and also some smaller group activity where conversations between 4 to 6 people might go on. I would share that I feel like, and the feedback we got from the people who came, was that it was helpful just to be talking openly about it. It's interesting, people have asked me who shows up at these cafes. We had quite an age range. We had people in their younger 20s. We had middle-aged. We had older. We had male and female. It wasn't primarily one or the other. And then we did a second cafe that was held in the community room of the Midway Library, because that's where we wanted to offer for convenience on location where we might be. And we again had about the same number of people, close to 20 people came. Some people have come to both cafes. Sometimes it would be someone new. But from that, we have opened the conversation and continue to invite people. Daniela and I have been discussing when we'll be able to offer a third cafe. And we were actually thinking of maybe now in the middle, it might be at the Lexington Library Community Room. We might go back to Furnace Mountain. She and I will have to discuss how and when we can schedule it and do it. But essentially, it was a Saturday afternoon from 1 to 3, open conversation that could go wherever people wanted to take it. I don't know, Diana, if you want to share anything about feedback from having been there. Has anyone else been to a death cafe? So if anyone would like to share a comment about what they thought about the death cafe, I invite you to do that.
I really enjoyed it. When I was there, I had recently lost my mother, and Diana asked me to go with her. And it was such a relief to just speak openly, because I felt very incompetent, like all of a sudden I was dealing with death and I didn't have a clue, especially when I was in charge. I'm in charge? I don't know anything. So I was sort of like, shouldn't I know more about this? Shouldn't I be more competent? And it was so nice just to hear people talk and laugh or cry, or it was wonderful. Do we need another mic?
I have long thought about death and the question of death. You know, it's the one thing we all face, and none of us know when. The thing that I got out of the death cafes, and I've actually attended 3 now, 2 at Furnace Mountain and 1 at Midway. And every time I attend, I find more comfort. And I think what happens for me is that I'm starting somehow, on some level, and I can't explain it, to accept that it is just part of life, which, of course, people say that. But somehow, I'm incorporating that that is just part of it. My first significant death that I faced, I was 12, and my very best friend died in a burning car crash. And I was not allowed to attend her funeral. My parents wouldn't allow me to do that. So, and to this day, I still mourn her because I wasn't able to attend to her, to be there for her. So, talking about it helps. Just bringing it to the surface and acknowledging what is helps me very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. You want to?
I could use a deaf cafe here. I volunteer at hospice every week, but it's so different when it's somebody that you emotionally are tied to very closely and is part of that inner circle of your life. And it's hard to talk about with people who don't know the person that you're talking to or have the knowledge of the history of your relationship to that person. So I would welcome an opportunity to hear other people's stories and be able to cry with somebody else.
I like to look at all the aspects of life as gifts. It's taken me a long time to get to this point, to look at everything as a gift. Isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And death is just the last gift. Now, I don't have anyone really close to me who has died. I'm not in a long time. And that all happened before I recognized that everything is a gift. So I pushed it all away. The Death Cafe didn't last nearly long enough. I realized 2 hours is a lot of time to host a party of that magnitude. But for me, sitting in a women's circle, having women's conversations about a topic that women got to talk about, it was really great. And I've only been to one. I wanted to go to the others, but I thought Midway was too far, and anyway. But maybe Lexington or here. Nice room.
It would be wonderful if you wanted to invite us to host one.
My husband died 4 years ago, and his daughter, my stepdaughter, was with me at the terrace in Berea that last half hour of his death, and we had the opportunity to say goodbye to him in many ways. But what I want to say is the fact that we shared this half hour makes Mona and me an entity like nobody else can share the way we shared. Everybody here, almost everybody, knew my husband and loved him too. But the fact that we were together for that precious time, that gift, that was a gift of being able to be there for that last half hour. And Mona and I have a relationship that is quite different from mine with my own two daughters. It's very precious.
Thank you. Before we have one or two others, I would add when you said that this is an interesting gift from my parents, who you don't go there, you don't talk about it. With both my parents, when they were dying, they both were 88 when they died, so they'd lived long lives. But with both of them, we were taking shifts so that somebody was with them. On their death certificate, it says failure to thrive because they chose to quit eating and drinking in order to leave. And I was the person that was with them both when they died. It was totally random, would you say by chance? But their gift to me was that I got to sit there and share that last breath and saw how it ended. And in all that time that they would not go there, there wasn't discussion, I thought that was the most intimate sharing that we could have had. And I don't think it was by chance. And my sister said, "Oh, thank God it was you. I'm glad it wasn't me." And I think of that as a major gift. There's something about that leaving and that finality that it feels that it's a very intimate time.
May I? I'm sorry, Lita, do you want to first? Yeah. Shirley.
Well, people, I'm retired now, but I'm a retired oncology nurse. I was an oncology nurse mostly at UK on the oncology ward, and then as the patient coordinator at hospice here, or hospice in Berea, but it covers several areas. I mentioned I was angry. I was just generally pissed off, excuse me, for everything. I mean, God, the mailman, it didn't matter, because I had been married 23 years to a jerk, and I paid my youngest daughter's last semester tuition at UK, and divorced him, or as we said, kicked him to the curb. And so that was fine. I fell in love with and married a old friend I'd known and his wife, and was deliriously happy. It was wonderful. Everything was fine. Well, because nobody enjoys a good joke like God does. And he developed, a way out type of cancer. It was stomach cancer. He'd never smoked. He didn't drink. He was a competitive runner. But he died. And as one of his colleagues, my first husband was also in the same department at Eastern, and as one of his colleagues said, "Well, it looks like to me the wrong historian died." And indeed, that was how I felt. The first one was a jerk. The second one was wonderful. I'm still not over it, and he died in 2004. I had worked at hospice. Well, they didn't send anybody out for a bereavement visit or anything. We had a memorial service and a little feast afterwards, a sort of like a wake, and thanks to the Unitarian Church. And working for hospice, as I did, they didn't send anybody. So I felt like, at the end, my family wasn't, well, I had my daughters here, but they had to go back and go to work. They offered no bereavement counseling for anybody. Well, we'll have one every 6 weeks or 6 months. So I went to one in Lexington. I was just full of a bunch of wing nuts. And, so I started drinking. And I drank for 5 years because I didn't know what else to do. So I was mad. I was mad at Webb for dying because, finally, after living with a jerk for so long, I found a real winner. And, he had a good life. Or one of my favorite ones that people, I think they ought to be executed, or people say, well, he's in a better place now. And I'm sure anybody who's lost someone has heard this same well-meaning, kind Christian lady doing her job of telling me that he was in a better place. No, he's dead. It ain't no better. It ain't no worse. Nobody knows. Maybe the shadow knows. I don't know. But nobody knows. So anyway, got it off.
Complicated with many layers is what grief usually is. And I was thinking as you were talking about the Buddha's teaching on attachment and on the suffering we have through attachment and impermanence, it's always amazing to me that no matter what, there's something surprising when death comes. Like, I've heard that saying, I knew people died, I just thought I'd be the exception. Or the person who dies because my mother-in-law was 45. Is that more tragic than somebody at 88 or 90? We have all of these scripts, and being able to approach something and be with it, to me, is the most important teaching that comes through my Zen practice. And we can't always do that. And so being able to experience the pain of the loss, of the impermanence, of getting kicked in the oh my God, they really do die. I really die. The person I love really die. Impermanence sucks. We don't like it. And the more we fight it and can't approach it and can't be in it, the more we suffer it. And so I don't have a solution to that. I'm just throwing out some of those layers that the Buddha spoke to so well, but being able to follow the teachings and do that is very challenging. And I think it's a mystery. And as I said, my big lesson has been the open-ended question, the koan of it all. And so being able to approach something and experience it can come in little bits or pieces as we move into something we're feeling, and it can be very difficult. But having a spiritual friend, a teacher, a person who can help with that is invaluable. Like you're saying, even the community here made such a difference for you when they could acknowledge it. That's really very important. And I know you want to make another comment, but I was going to share, we're going to end up, I think, time-wise. No, you go ahead and make your comment, and I'll share one thing about the practices that I do, that we won't get into a whole lot, but that there are ways we can help ourselves approach.
This is brief. My mother, Sylvia Schneller, there I go again, lived with my husband and I for about a year and a half, and then it became untenable in many ways, not because we didn't want to take care of her full time, we couldn't, so she moved 2 minutes down the road to a nursing home where she didn't want to be, but she started a poetry group. I mean, but she was just ebbing and flowing with her life. She got to the point where she decided she wouldn't eat and she wouldn't take the meds, which of course upset the nurses greatly, and I understand. So my brother Paul and a friend from Bloomington, Indiana, came down to visit my mother on a Saturday, knowing that she was dying. And at around 5 o'clock, my brother Paul said, well, I guess we have to leave now, Mom. And my mother said, and so do I. And within 3 to 4 hours, she was gone. It was remarkable. And my cousin Leatrice said, you know, when Sylvia made up her mind, that was it. And that was wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody else who shared, because I think there is so much power in sharing stories about our lives. And nobody's coming up with any answer or solution, but the sharing in itself has great power. Because we're running out of time, I would end when I was saying, besides the Death Cafe, I wanted to share a little bit about practices dealing with death. this is a book, and I have 3 or 4 books up here that I thought I would bring. I think those are more effective than reading lists that are just a name of something. If anyone would like to take time to look through these books as you leave, I recommend all of them. But there are practices in the Buddhist tradition that we do around death. As I said, Maranasati is the word for meditation on death. I have committed to taking up a number of these practices in a very purposeful way, which I find to be helpful to me, not always easy, but I think powerful. And there's a great description in this book Larry Rosenberg wrote about the practices that can be helpful in Buddhist tradition when we're contemplating death. And there are times in our lives when we can do that and handle it, times that we need to be well aware of how much we can handle. But I will die, I'm going to die is just a meditation that you do, repeating over and over to yourself to let it sink in. I am going to die. There's another meditation on the dissolution of our body. The Dalai Lama does this every morning. And you picture your body deteriorating, rotting, your muscles are gone, your bones are left. The whole picturing of what it looks like when this physical body disappears. So there are many meditations that have to do with sitting with the reality of death and that it is real. And there are things we can look at to help us do that. In the Buddhist practice, that follows a lot of other practice first. So I'm not saying anybody who wanted to can sit down and start doing this and it would be beneficial, but you strengthen first with your own practice. But I would just tell you that in my experience in my old age, I'm realizing more and more the value of approaching something that scares us, grosses us out, confuses us, causes us distress. In our ability to learn to be with those things, we can often release the resistance and the suffering that go with them. And so being able to approach those things that scare us and make us uncomfortable and are difficult in ways that for that individual are manageable. And I think it's important that a spiritual friend be able to help you with that, in my opinion. But purposeful practice related to death has been of great benefit to me. And again, I'm not saying I have all the answers. I'm not saying I would never presume to tell you what you should believe or do about death. But I would share that I think it is very important in life, and it is very much a part of life. I think of that codependent arising and the circumstances and cells that came together and created my physical body are going to end up dispersing at my death. Those cells will disperse, the spirits will disperse. Whatever part has brought that together, I see as a continuum. Everyone comes to their own place on that if they give it time. And so I would close by just saying, I think it's very important that we think about and acknowledge death as part of our life, and that whatever level you can do that through reading, through discussion, Death Cafe, whatever would be helpful for you, I think it is a worthy way to spend our time. So I know, I think we're over on time for your all services. I am happy to stay and talk to anyone who would like to. I was thinking I would close. Another thing in our Buddhist practices is the Heart Sutra is form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Very complicated Buddhist teaching, but it gives space. I call it luminous space, not desolated space. That's a very important teaching. And the Diamond Sutra, which reminds us of how impermanent everything is and that it comes and goes. And I would finish with 2 things quickly, and then I know some of you probably need to go. This is called a mock talk. It's used in Zen practice. and I'm going to do the Diamond Sutra with the mock talk, and then I'm going to do the singing bowl for 1 minute of closing to gather ourselves. So that's how I would like to finish. For my invitation to be here, and again for the killer band. I loved it. I think anything that drops our mind into our heart, in Chinese medicine, they don't have a separate word for heart and mind. Shen is our heart and mind together. And I think bringing those two together is something that we all need to think about. Appreciation to all my teachers, appreciation for this experience.